the best response you can have to a payoff in a thriller is someone goes, "Oh, right, I forgot. Of course, I should have thought that."
On Story offers a look inside the creative process from today's leading writers, creators, and filmmakers. All of our content is recorded live at Austin Film Festival and at our year-round events. To view previous episodes, visit onstory.tv. On Story is brought to you in part by the Alice Kleberg Reynolds Foundation, a Texas family providing innovative funding since 1979. From Austin Film Festival, this is On Story, a look inside the creative process from today's leading writers, creators, and filmmakers. This week's On Story, Game of Thrones co-creators David Benioff and D.B. Weiss.
When we pitched HBO originally, we said this is not about a million creatures fighting a million other creatures in a giant fantasy environment. This is about people. It's like War of the Roses. It's like Lion in Winter.
In this episode, Game of Thrones co-creators David Benioff and D.B. Weiss detail the process of adapting George R.R. Martin's best-selling books into an epic HBO series which changed the landscape of modern television. What an incredible feat pulling this show off was. And so I'd really love to hear about how you all approached it and your pitfalls and your successes and the things you learned from it.
You know, before we could go into HBO, we had to convince George to let us pitch it. And so we had a meeting with him, a long lunch meeting where he sort of questioned our bona fides, which were few because we hadn't actually made anything. We had never worked in TV. So the end of this lunch was him giving us a test question of who was Jon Snow's mother, which hadn't been revealed in the books yet. And because we got that right, I think that's why we got the chance to do this show.
We pitched the pilot episode in detail, and we told the story of the pilot, and we had a back and forth routine where he'd take a scene, I'd take a scene, and we really kind of gave them a sense of how this would feel. And the pilot was contained. It all took place almost all took place there was the North, and then there was the Daenerys bits, but it was 2 locations, and we stripped it down in such a way that it was understandable to somebody listening to it for 20 minutes. And then we gave a very quick overview of who the families were and the main players and like what they were after, but we really kept it intentionally very vague. And we mentioned the highlight. We mentioned the bit where, of course, we told them about Ned's head coming off, and we told them about the dragons being born. And we told them the things that made them realize, the things that would make people go, oh, when they saw them and want to keep watching. So they knew those things were there, but we didn't really explain a lot of the details because I think people's ability to follow something like that verbally is really limited.
It's terrifying because pitches are always a little bit nerve-wracking unless you're the kind of person who likes pitching, in which case you're insane. And because the more you care about it, obviously, the more you want it, the more stressed you are. And we wanted this desperately. We were so in love with these books and so believed in what the series could be. And we were warned before we were pitching to Carolyn Strauss, who was president of production at HBO at that time. And we were warned ahead of time, Carolyn's a really tough pitch. She will not smile. She will not laugh at your jokes. She's just going to stare at you like, she's a stone cold killer. So we were prepared for that. And we came in and we did our little song and dance thing. And I think towards the very end, she actually chuckled, right? I mean, I don't know if she laughed, but she sort of...
I think we made her laugh.
Kind of like her lip kind of
felt
went
like
up
a victory.
Yeah.
Wait, was there a part of the pitch that was that funny?
I don't even remember what it was. It wasn't a particularly funny episode.
Years ago. Yeah.
She laughed when the kid got thrown out the window.
The pilot that you'd first done you guys said was not good. Can you talk about, well, so what happened? Like, so what was in that pilot that wasn't good, and what did you do?
It was sort of a film TV hybrid in a lot of ways, in terms of the production design, in terms of the shooting, the scheduling, the shoot. All of this stuff was done in a way that was probably had more in common with film than television, but it needed to be done on a TV budget. It needed to be done within a TV time frame. So it was everyone involved was kind of figuring out how to make something like this for the first time, and it took more than one try, which we were very fortunate to get a second chance, because I think they were most likely about 50-50 on whether or not to give us that chance. But
a lot of the mistakes were very basic, elemental writing mistakes, exposition mistakes. Like I had this thing, or we both did, but it's like, I don't want any lines in there like, oh, sister, what do you think about this? Like, sweet sister, what? None of that crap, right? I don't want any of that. And so then we showed the pilot to these guys who are three of the smartest writers out there, Craig Mazin, Scott Frank, and Ted Griffin. And the final scene of the pilot, for people who have seen the show, you might remember, it's Jaime Lannister and Cersei Lannister having sex at the top of a tower. And it's supposed to be shocking because they're twins.
He saw us.
It's all right, it's all right, it's all right.
He saw us.
I heard you the first time. Quite the little climb, aren't you? How old are you, boy?
10.
10. The things I do for love.
It's not shocking if you don't realize that they're brother and sister.
They're
and
related,
none of our three brilliant writer friends knew that, because we hadn't made it clear. And so now if you go back and watch the pilot that actually aired, you'll see there are a lot of lines where Jamie's like, sweet sister, what, all these, which are terrible, but at least you know by the end that they're brother and sister.
So how did you get through that first year, essentially, and what did you take away from it?
Well, after the misadventure of the pilot, we thought things feel pretty smooth now. And a couple months before we wrapped on season 1, we got a phone call from Gina Balian, who was our brilliant executive at that time. She's now at FX. And she said, guys, have you seen that the timings have come in, like the early timings on the first cuts of the episodes? And we were like, yeah. And she said, because they're coming in really short, right? And we're like, oh, yeah. And some of our episodes were clocking at like 39 minutes and 42 minutes. And what had happened was that we had written our original scripts, which had all, timed out properly. But then as you start making the season and you start running out of money, we'd been cutting all these things. And so we had this literally 2 months before the end of shooting season 1. And we were 100 minutes short of a viable season. And we had virtually no money left, which meant that we had to write all these really cheap scenes. So they tended to be 2 or 3 handers, just people in a room talking, and the scenes that you could just shoot in a morning. And it was terrifying at first, and then it became fun because there were all these scenes that weren't, because of their nature, they weren't really plot related, like the central plot scenes were already in there. And so these were scenes that had to be interesting enough to justify their existence, but they didn't really move the plot forward. So in some of my favorite scenes from the first season, like Dan wrote this great scene between King Robert and Queen Cersei. And it was because we realized that we didn't have a single scene with the two of them alone together in the rest of the show.
We haven't had a real fight in 9 years. Backstabbing doesn't prepare you for a fight, and that's all the realm is now. Backstabbing and scheming and money grubbing. Sometimes I don't know what holds it together.
Our marriage.
It was really the first time I think that we'd started out writing these scenes, and these weren't scenes from George's books. And so this was the first time I think we deviated at all really from the central narrative. I think we got to know the characters a lot better. By that point, we'd already been working with these actors for several months, so we knew their voices. They were in our heads. When you're writing for King Robert and you have Mark Addy's voice in your head, or Cersei with Lena, it's just a huge boon. And that was, again, a weird circumstance where our inexperience ended up kind of helping because we learned so much from that.
So, you weren't trying to just make the books, right? You were.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say the first season was actually quite faithful to the first book, and the second season maybe 10% less. Every season got a little bit less, partly just because, as Dan said before, George's story kept getting so much bigger and bigger.
He didn't write it with television producibility in mind, and we had to compress and condense in ways, to make it producible for television, just because if we'd included all the characters that were in the book, we were running up against a situation where people would you'd be dropping the balls of the Tyrions and the Dannys and the Aryas that you cared about to service these new people. So at a certain point, we made the decision we'd stop putting pieces on the board for the most part and start, playing with the pieces that were already there.
It's possible we should have made that decision like a season earlier.
Not entirely impossible.
I remember, when we were outlining season 1, and at that point it was just the writer's room was really just the two of us and Brian Cogman, and we would talk about the season, and we would start putting scenes down on index cards and putting the cards up on the board as you do, and the different plot lines had different colors, so. For instance, maybe not season 1, but later on, Arya would have yellow, and the Dany storyline would be green, and so forth. I think by season 5 we had
season 4 or 5 was the most, and at one point I think we had 11 or 12 different colors on the board, and I remember looking at it and wondering, is this going to actually make sense to anybody?
Well, so some person on the internet created this, which was really helpful to me because I started my own.
Would have been helpful to me too.
That just gave. I'm showing them this thing that just gives the families and the main characters.
Oh, thank you. God, yeah. Where was this 8 years ago?
Could have used that. Oh, her notes are on the back. We don't want.
There is a lot of online stuff that was actually useful to look at, because there's some great maps online, and they were actually better than the maps in the books.
We're both kind of geographically challenged. We don't have a very good sense of where we are in space, so having maps of where these things were happening was helpful.
Did you really sit down and try to boil those concepts of what the books are about down before you started your process of creating the show, so that you, in other words, and what did you use as your foundation to build the episodes out of, the seasons out of?
I don't remember the name of the Russian poet, but there's some famous Russian poet who read his poem, and then someone in the audience said, "Do you mind explaining? I didn't totally understand. Do you mind explaining the poem?" And he reread the poem, and that was his response. It's like, that's it. And I feel like it's such a complex story, and I don't think we ever tried to reduce it to kind of like end the theme. And people would ask, and so sometimes you'd have to have kind of a prepared answer. But the honest answer for me is we didn't have like a Game of Thrones is about power and family and like how the dynamics, and that's all true. It is about power and it is about family. But I think it's also true that you could have two shows that have the same themes and they're wildly different, and one's good and one's bad, and ultimately it's about the complexities that you're trying to depict. It's the characters, and to try to kind of cram it into a single aphorism isn't helpful for me.
I mean, the biggest influence on us obviously was George. I mean, he's the reason we're got to do this. He's the reason it exists, and obviously we loved his books more than anything and wanted to do them justice. But it's very hard to work on something for 364 and a half days a year for 10 years without feeling like it's your own. I think Steve Martin once said something close to paraphrasing, but he said something to the effect that every adaptation process is like a marriage that ends in divorce. And he said sometimes there are amicable divorces, sometimes there are ugly divorces. He goes, you always start with the best of intentions. You're going to be faithful, forever, and then you start to have some other ideas, and you start to stray a little bit. And in a way, but just because of the scope of what George created, I think we ended up with what ended up being a very amicable divorce from the source material, because we ran out of it.
I think it's interesting, though, that I think we were all, for years, with network television, just regular network TV, led down this path like you didn't have really big things that were unexpected happen in general network drama, you know? And so obviously that tables turned completely, but you all really took it to an extreme in some cases. I mean, you'd bring a character in and lead us to believe they were going to do something and be a much bigger part of something, and then all of a sudden, boom, you know, Hodor kills him.
I think that's why we had such well-behaved actors.
And sometimes it's just casting. I mean, in the Hard Home episode, we cast this incredible Danish actress for a really small role that was originally written for a man, and then someone said, what if this was a woman? We didn't change anything. We didn't change the dialogue. We didn't change the character's name, Carsey. We just cast this great actress from Borgen.
Yeah, Birgitte Hart Sorensen.
Yeah. And she's just so good and so charismatic that I think as you're watching, you're like, well, there's no way she's just a one episode character, because like she's going to become something important.
I'll never trust a man in black. But I trust you, Tormund. If you say this is the way, we're with you.
And then she dies. And that's really casting, I mean, ultimately.
Well, I mean, I think it was about, initially, it would time out that episode 9 would be when a big thing would happen, then you deal with the aftermath in episode 10. You did that for a couple of years, but then at a certain point, that becomes, within the context of the show, people who are familiar with the show, becomes a predictable move. And like, so we said, let's kill Joffrey in episode 2, because nothing big ever happens in a second episode of anything. Like, the second episode is always the one that you can wait to see later, because people come out swinging at the first episode because they want to convince everybody, this is great, keep watching it, you know, and then once they've got you on the hook, they feel like they can relax the tension a bit. So that was just a place where, you know, we had discussed it could have the possibility of it happening in the first episode, and we thought that's kind of obvious to come out with this big, you know, this inciting incident or whatever you would call it in the first episode. Let's wait till the second episode, really milk it in the whole, you know, make a big long wedding sequence that seems like it could be about anything except this, and then have that come at the end.
Good. Knees washing down.
If it please your grace, Lady Sansa is very tired.
No, you'll wait here. I'm...
Your grace.
It's nothing.
A lot of it was just the decisions that were made in the context of the show as a whole. You know, like, what have we done before, and what would be a more surprising or more interesting way to do the same thing later?
HBO, a lot of risks always with their content, and certainly was always ahead of the curve. And you guys, though, really went so deep in this brutality in some cases, but yet when you got into the battle scenes, I mean, they were pretty incredible. I mean, and you had a lot of that in there, but maybe it's because the shots were, you didn't linger on the death and destruction in the battle scenes as much, you know.
It's weirdly easier to do in that context because, you know, there's so much going on, and it needs to feel like being there would feel, which is frenetic and you know, disorienting and chaotic.
But you'll never know!
I felt like in that Battle of the Bastards, where you got the shot choices were really interesting because you were really focusing on just the horror of being in it as opposed. And so were you guys active in those choices, or were your DPs really working?
Yeah, I mean, well, the two of us and Miguel talked a lot, you know, exhaustively and exhaustingly about the importance of shooting the battle from a point of view. There were 3 points of view, even like when Sansa rides in, we wanted, even if it was a big giant wide shot that gave you kind of the geography of the battle, we wanted that to be from someone's potential point of view if possible, because it's what prevents it from seeming like what a lot of, especially effects-driven battles, they all look a certain way and there's a video game quality to them. And it's because there is no real camera lots of the time. So when you can do anything and you do anything, like you're swooping around with a God's eye kind of point of view of a camera that doesn't exist and a set that doesn't exist, it can start to feel very fake very quickly. We wanted to pin it to character.
I really don't look at that show as a fantasy show. I do look at it as a show about humanity, you know, like, or the lack of.
Well, what HBO has been so great at doing for a long time is taking really established genres, maybe even tired genres, and blowing them up. You know, so Sopranos took gangsters, and The Wire with the cop drama, and the Westerns with Deadwood, and on and on. And that's the same kind of approach we want to do with this. So yes, it's a story where ice demons are real and dragons are real, but in some ways I think it was a resistance to Lord of the Rings, and both the books and also the Peter Jackson adaptation. And you know, and that was in our pitch. It was like, it's not Lord of the Rings. It's not going to be a million orcs versus a million humans. And you know, our hobbits get. I mean, it was just very like, it's darker, it's more sexual, and it's very much HBO.
Genre on television is a tightrope. It's very easy to fall, tonally, I think it's very easy to fall either into like a very arch direction or, you know, kind of it can go campy. We were always 15 degrees away from Monty Python, the Holy Grail. Like every scene, you're like, if you change these 3 lines, this is the Holy Grail. But and it's also, it's just difficult with, I mean, we would always endeavor, as David mentioned earlier, to kind of, like with terms of fantasy exposition and fantasy proper nouns, it was almost like a game of Jenga where you're trying to pull out as many of them as possible without the whole thing falling over. And the first pilot, we pulled out one too many and the whole thing fell over and it didn't make any sense. But even going forward, we tried, you know, we tried to keep that stuff to a minimum because we didn't just want it to appeal to a fantasy fan base. We wanted them to love it, and we wanted like our parents to love it, and people who played professional football to love it, and we kind of wanted to reach a wider audience. And to do that, the tone was very important. Like dragons, people riding dragons is a very difficult thing. Like Amanda, David's wife, would be constantly sending us emails of just like the cheesiest like cartoons of people on giant birds and like, you know, like My Little Pony stuff, because she's like, that's what this looks like if you do it wrong. So, and the first time we got her on the dragon, we had never done that before, and there are a lot of things that don't look right or they look silly when you shoot someone riding an imaginary beast that way. And we had kind of figured out how to make those shots look good more often than not.
The blood work looks better in season 8 than it did in season 2. And, you know, the stunt work just kept getting better and better. Everything just kept improving largely because we had the same team and we all got more experience together.
You basically made 30-some feature films. So that's, I mean, over 8 years, which is more than any filmmaker out there, you know, pretty much. That was, I mean, not just that, but they had so many of those were massive set pieces. They had to be exhausting, though, to shoot those.
Well, they sure were for Miguel Sapochnik. And you know, I think I'd say the first 3 or 4 years, we never missed a night shoot. You know, 4 years, probably first 4 seasons. And it was sometime around season 5 or 6 when I was standing there at 4 a.m. in Belfast, and I'm looking around. I was like, I wonder if I just sort of like back away if anyone's got.
I felt like Homer fading into the hedges, just kind of disappearing. Will they notice that I'm not here?
So by the time Miguel did the final season battle at Winterfell, which were all night shoots he shot 55 straight on location, and then I think another 10 in a row off location. So it's something like 65 straight nights for Miguel. I think it was over 70 for the crew, which is debilitating. I mean, it's just, you know, for anyone who's ever worked on a night shoot, it's tough doing 10 straight weeks of them.
It was really the feeling that everybody was pulling together to accomplish something that was bigger than any of us. There was something very energizing about that. I would say that the adrenaline of just getting to do the greatest job on earth and being lucky enough to have the greatest job on earth, it really was. It was, you'd wake up in the morning after 4 hours sleep and you never question for a second, like, why am I getting out of bed and doing this? Because this is what I dreamed of doing since I was 8 years old.
You've been watching On Writing Game of Thrones on Story. On Story is part of a growing number of programs in Austin Film Festival's On Story project, including the On Story PBS series, now streaming online, the On Story radio program, the On Story podcast, and the On Story book series, available where books are sold. To find out more about On Story and Austin Film Festival, visit onstory.tv or austinfilmfestival.com. Want to see On Story live? Join us at Austin Film Festival's annual Writers Conference each October. Visit www.austinfilmfestival.com to find out more about badges and passes to attend the festival.